Talk to Eric. Those are kind of like, that's one container. And then the next container, kind of, you can see that it's the same. It's kind of, but it's still built off that same template. So that's how design can scale in a professional organization. And that's kind of how you work with development. So you work on these little buckets of pages and little elements, and they all come together to create a cohesive interface. So kind of, let's begin with the atom. So this is kind of the starting point to a web page. So let's say you're building a form field. Form fields usually have kind of different fields to fill in your username, maybe your first name, your last name, your birthday. Kind of, those are the beginning elements, and that's what you start with. That's how you start with an atom. Then you move to what's called a molecule. So now you can see the progression of how these begin to make something more complex. So a molecule in this case are several atoms combined together. So now we have kind of the button here, and we have two inputs. So think about the input as an atom, and then the button as an atom. Now they start to come together. So kind of, once you have that, that begins to scale up as well. Then you create the organism. So in this case, that's the more delicate part of the UI. That's when they start to form together. So now we're getting a bit more complex in this case. So we added more elements, and now that creates the full form, the full form field. So now once that's all together, that's an organism that can be reused throughout the website. This then leads to what's called a template, which are the page level structures. So kind of, this is where some people who just work on wireframes, this is kind of where their final step is. So when you create wireframes, it's a bunch of different elements that come together. So thinking about the Protothon today, you might have all these different elements of the UI that can be reused across scale, and that begins to scale up and allow you to create, the full web page. And then from there, this is when your high fidelity work comes in, and this is called pages. So this is, in a sense, converting all your page templates into a final high fidelity UI design. So in this case, for example, like we saw, like the sign in here with the login, the password, and the whole box. Once you begin to scale that up, then you can create the more visual aspect of it, and that becomes your combined page. So how does that work inside Figma? And why is it important? So, atomic design allows you to design at scale and also design for handoff. And this also helps you to build your design system. So I want to showcase today how you can create a really simple, in this case, I'll just go through a simple web page with a nav bar to showcase how you can scale up atomic design. So let's create a web page. So when we think about a web page, I'll go through kind of my design process, like in a really quick way. So let's say I want to have a standard web page, which is 1920 by 1080. So I know that on my web page, I'll probably want to have like a nav bar, my logo. Within the nav bar, I kind of want to have a call to action. I'll want links, for example, and then maybe a button. As well, on my web page, I might want maybe a form field, some pictures, and let's just do something simple like this. So let's think about the elements that I'll need in my nav bar. So I'll probably need to have the CTA, the links, and the button. So how can we begin to design that at scale? So let's create, for example, the first button heading. So let's say we call this heading. Something that I like to do is once I have these headings done, is I can go right click and I can create a component. So these components can be used across scale throughout your web page. And for example, this will become more apparent as I begin to build this design system out. Let's create a really simple button. So let's make it into a nice bluish navy. Maybe in this case, I want to reuse my heading style inside the button. Now, because I've created this component, I can easily do that. So what I can do is I can go to Assets, and then I can click on Heading. Now, of course, this is blending in. So Figma has this really cool trick called Variance. So in this case, let's go back to Heading. And then I'm going to go into the side panel here, and there's this tool called a variant inside Figma. And variants are kind of different ways that specific element could be used. So for example, you have on your iPhone like a dark mode and a light mode. That's a very use case where we can apply this to. So maybe I want a darker heading and a lighter heading. So if I go into heading here, I can change the fill under variant 2 to something that's white. Now in this case, when I create my button, now I can see that on the right-hand side of my heading, I have variant 2. And when I click on that, then my button changes into this new white color to achieve something that I want. So now as I begin to create this button, maybe I want to give it some rounded corners, and I'm satisfied with this button. So what I can do now is I can right-click again and create a component. Now I can call this component, for example, button. And in this case, let's create as well maybe a form field. So let's say I want to create an input for my user. I can start by drawing out the input. In this case, let's make it have a white background. And then let's say it has that same kind of blue stroke on the outside. We'll change up the elements a bit. So with a stroke of 5 and maybe a border radius of 10. Now I can go in and create my style of button. So I can say, let's type here. And now this is just placeholder text, and I'll show how this can also be used to scale up in the future. So let's say this is what my element wants to be. I can right click, and then I can create a component, and let's call it form field. So now I have these very simple components being made. So now let's create a web page in this case. So let's create a frame. We'll do it at 1920 by 1080 again. And now let's create a nav bar. So let's say I want my nav bar to be 1810 by, maybe we'll go 60, or we'll make it 105. Now what I can do is I can begin to take those elements I created earlier under my assets. So let's say I have a heading, and I realize, oh, now my heading's a little bit too big. The beauty about kind of these components is that I'm able to adjust them. So let's say I go into heading, and then I realized my heading is 46 pixels, and that's a bit too big for me. Let's say I would reduce it down to 20. Now you can see that when I reduce it down, all those changes reflect right away inside the component, which is super handy when you're designing systems at scale. So if you need to make a change to something inside your Figma file, then it can update everything at the same time. So let's say I created 10 buttons, but I didn't make them components. That would mean I'd have to go back to that button 10 separate times, and that's super time consuming, especially in a Protothon. So this will help you to design up for scale just a little bit better. Now in this case, I want to reduce my button down too. So let's say this is my new button style. And I also want to change this. So this is also 46. Let's make it 20 and bring this down as well. Excuse me, I'm just going to get a sip of water. All right, so once we have that done, now I can go back to my nav bar and I can see that all these changes have already been made. So to me, the advantage about this is that I adjusted the font size, I adjusted the button, and now when I go back to this page, that's already been updated for me, and I didn't have to do any additional legwork on that. So now as I begin to scale this nav bar up, so let's say, now of course I don't want heading in my nav bar, I want home, about, and then maybe another link. The beauty about these components are that you're actually able to change the text inside. So I can go home, I can go about, and then I can create a third one. So in this case, let's say contact. So this allows me to begin to design up with scale. And then let's say as I begin to scale this up, and I create a nav bar, and then let's say I add in a logo. So I'll take this one I made earlier, change the color. So let's do something like this, for example. So now I have my nav bar. So as we can see, we began to take those atoms of our components that we made, we combined them together to create molecules, and then now we have this organism, which is a nav bar, which now can be used if I also create a component from this. Let's call this component nav bar. Whenever I create a new page, for example, now if I go under my assets, under frame 6, because that's the frame that I've created now. Now I have a nav bar that can be consistently scaled across all my web pages or all my apps that I decide to create. And this is really simple. This is really super handy as you begin to develop out your design system and design out your web pages. This will allow you to design at scale, which is super important. So for example, like in the previous example of the form field, I can begin to create different elements of a form field here. In this case. So this will allow you to scale up your design effectively. So I hope that just gives you a really quick overview of Figma and components and atomic design. And I hope that helped you to scale up your design work. And I'd be happy for any questions, either in the Discord, and I'd be happy to answer them for you.
Awesome. Thanks, Jordan. I think right now everyone is focused on the competition itself, but for those watching the recording, you can either ask us on our channel whenever you want, or send us a DM, or just reach out to us on social media, because we'll be posting this eventually. Yeah, I think, Zoe, do you have anything else you want to try? Since we have good amount of time to our next like hour. Anything interesting coming to mind?
Not at the moment right now, but are there any like old Figma projects that you'd want to share with some of the newer designers out there, and how frustrating it can be when like when you're just starting out? I know for me, I'm still learning how to use Figma and I get lost.
Yeah, I can see. Yeah, so this is one of the more recent files that I worked on. So this was a side project I did for Purdy's Chocolatier. And this was kind of a mobile website that we created that talks about how we can identify chocolate and how we can pick chocolate. So I think that, as you can see, my Figma file is pretty messy. I've got wireframes here. I've got different iterations.
Do you have any tips for people wanting to organize their Figma a bit better?
Yeah, don't do what I do. Make sure to name your iterations really well. But one technique that we did that I like to do, especially when you work with the team, is that you create kind of comments or little, descriptions on the side. So people know what these iterations are, for example. So in this case, we did home 2, and then we just described it a little bit how we, how we want the copy to be. You can also add in comments in this case. So it just really helps to kind of get that back and forth feedback, especially when you work with a distributed team and might not be able to meet in person. So just really utilizing the tools within Figma in terms of commenting and kind of any different ways you like to communicate. Like, for example, FigJam is something new that Figma introduced. That's kind of like, that's kind of like a whiteboarding tool. You can definitely use that as well.
Well, I have a question. I see that earlier you had like text style or like paragraph styles and like colors. Can you explain how you got those? Like on this side before I saw it.
Oh, on here. Yeah,
text
so
style.
yeah, it's a good question. So, oops, wrong file. The good thing about Figma is that you can actually create text styles and you can create header styles. So in this case, like let's say I go to here. Let's drag this in. Oops, sorry about that. Let's say I do this, like I want some text here. What you're able to do is kind of create those styles. In order to create it, what you would have to do is in your atomic design, let's say this is a header one. Let's say I want header 1 to be 32 pixels and black. What you would do here is you'd go to text styles and press create text style. So this is also another atomic design skill that you can bring into your work. And that just helps you scale up kind of headers and text within your file. So this can also be removed if you press. Sorry about that. But yeah, this can be changed and then adjusted as well within the side panel if you choose not to use your style. So you can detach it and then change it up, or you can just work consistently within your text styles.
Wait, what about colors? What about colors?
So colors, you can actually go to fill, and let's say I have this purple I like here. I can go to excuse me, this color style and press create style. So I can say, let's say this is Protothon purple. Now I have this color style, Protothon purple, which can be used across any element that utilizes color within my files. So if I go back to my atomic design and I press my rectangle here, let's say you want my form field to have a stroke now of atomic purple, I can simply go to my color style here, and then I can see it's Protothon purple. For your files, you'll probably see less colors because I have a bunch that I use for my own personal work in different projects, but for you, you'd only have kind of one category, and you can just press that, and then you can just choose the different colors you like as you build up your color library.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Oh my gosh, those are some really great tips, and I hope everyone else will think so as well. But thank you so much for hosting this impromptu workshop with us.
Glad to help.